We're looking at the courage to build is our lesson for tonight, and the case study is with the character of Nehemiah. And I went back this afternoon and sat down as if for the first time and read again through the whole book of Nehemiah. I almost just want to have a lesson on Nehemiah. There's so many wonderful lessons in the book of Nehemiah. We'll be dipping in and out of the book because he certainly does. But the things that we want to cover tonight, we want to talk about dreams and discouragement, determination, talk about planning, presentation, problem solving, the role of praise, and actually, as he mentions it, and as it actually comes out in the book of Nehemiah, it becomes identified as a time of celebration, and we'll talk about that. And then 10 steps for encouraging groups, and someone's already said tonight that when they saw that section and read through it, like, boy, that's good management principles for any group. But for those of you who are small group leaders, there's several things in there that would be very pertinent to leading small groups. And you might be able to see the immediate application to being in that role. Well, let's talk about dreams. In the book of Nehemiah, it starts off by saying, in the month of Kislev in the 20th year while I was in the citadel of Susa, Hanani, one of my brothers, came from Judah with other men, and I questioned them, and this is the historical context. I questioned them about the Jewish remnant that survived the exile and also about Jerusalem. So he's asking about that situation, and this is the historical context. And here is their response after he asked them. They said to me, those who survived the exile and are back in the province are in great trouble and disgrace. The wall of Jerusalem is broken down, and its gates have been burned with fire. Now, I'm sure that's a pretty short description, but if you can just imagine what it would look like as they're describing that. And to start off with, when you think about dreams, sometimes you face reality, and if you're not careful, reality can cancel out dreams pretty quickly. You're like, and sometimes, this is how we do it sometimes. Have you ever had somebody, they come up to you, they got this exciting idea, and then you realize how impractical it is, and then our response is something like this. What world are you living in? That sounds like pie in the sky. And we've all been guilty of letting out the hot air in someone's balloon of dreams. And part of it's because, what's the expression? Pipe dreams. It's part of it's because we're not sure when someone shares their dream, how in the world can that come about? And so one of the things that I would challenge all of us is that when someone comes to you with the dream, don't be guilty of squashing the dream. You don't have to know the particulars. You don't have to know how it's going to happen. But things have to start with the idea in a dream. And isn't it interesting that maybe you've been the person privileged to hear this person's dream, and they're testing it out. And your role is to say, man, that is fantastic. I never thought of that. And you need to find a way to be the one that encourages someone's dream. Because once the encouragement of the dream happens, even though they're faced with reality, if by the will of God the dream can eventually occur as reality, it's got to start somewhere. And it may be that at that moment, God wants you to be the first one to pour water on it so the seed can germinate and start to sprout. So that's an amazing thing. And I think back in my life, I can think of certain people at particular moments in my life that that's exactly what their function was. That here was a little seed of a dream, and they recognized it, and they poured some water on it so the seed could begin to germinate, and then it would come forth later and bear fruit. So this is really, really interesting. It's really important to recognize that sometimes when you look at reality, if you're just being pragmatic, all dreams would die. So you can't stop there. And I want you to notice what Nehemiah does. This really struck me. I sat down and I underlined this. Now remember, he's heard the report. When I heard these things, I sat down and wept. And for some days I mourned and fasted. And I prayed before the God of heaven. So look at what he did. He was impacted by the reality of it. So when he begins to have courage to implement the dream, it's not, what's the expression we use? He doesn't proceed like ostrich with head in the sand. He's well aware of what the situation is. And the dire circumstances they described to him impacted him so much emotionally, this is how he initially responded. And see, the rest, this book could have been really short, because it could have stopped here, and Nehemiah said, well, God, what's the use? It's never going to happen. We deserve what we got, so let's just live with it. End of the book of Nehemiah. No, that's not. This is just the beginning. This is how it starts. And so he has this prayer. We won't take time to go into the prayer. I might later on if we have time, but it's interesting to me that as he then begins to pray, he realizes he wants to take part of ownership of being accountable for Israel's history. And you really have to admire Nehemiah. There's times when Nehemiah will use the language us and we, when you know really good and well it's the people that got them all into trouble. But he still says us and we, because he wants to join with them in this. Sometimes when we think about dreams can be tempered by responsibilities. And so we have to weigh the difference between what a dream can be and what are the responsibilities. One of the things that the author says in our book, there's a price to pay for ideas. When you go from a dream to reality, in order for the dream to occur as a reality, there will be a cost, sacrifice, commitment. If we lived in the kind of world where if you had a dream, think about this, and we could snap our fingers and immediately the dream would happen. And you may have watched movies where that kind of dynamic happens, and you're like, wow, it's not like that in real life. So you just snap your finger and your dream would happen. Well, that's not life. When there is a dream, there's a price to pay for those ideas. Commitment on your part, sacrifice, dedication, perseverance, all those words that we can think of that are necessary for the dream to occur. And he also has a statement that's really fascinating to me, that dreams have formative developmental stages. And this is really important, because if you try to force a stage for the development of an idea before its time is ready, whatever the dream is, it can crash to the ground. So dreams go through stages, and they have to slowly be formed. And we're an impatient people. We like for things, the dream, the reality, let's have it tomorrow. Well, no. Some dreams take years to be realized. And sometimes it takes a lifetime for us to recognize a dream in our own life. And we have to be patient with that. Now, over the course of decades, the foundation of the temple was laid, in Nehemiah's time, but the restoration was still unfinished. And they went through phases. And here's something that's really interesting. In chapter 3 of Nehemiah, let me just sort of refer to this in broad terms. If you think about the wall of Jerusalem as it was being rebuilt for the security of the city, in chapter 3, you have all of these individuals mentioned in their families that took sections of the wall. Each one took sections of the wall. And we're going to talk a little bit about how it's significant in encouragement that you give people specific tasks to do that they're invested in. And I really thought it was interesting. When you get over to about 2/3 of the way through chapter 3, there are several who made repairs in front of their house. And then others who made repairs beside their house. Or others just right across from their house. It's interesting, it refers to that. And you know good and well that the people who are doing this, they're really invested in this because this is where their house is, so they want this wall to be built well. And I think, though the text doesn't go into this, I suspect Nehemiah took some time creating that kind of work environment, making sure that people were willing to be invested and work hard, and particularly in sections that they were interested in. And I'm sure that that made a real big difference. Now, when the dream is there, there can also be discouragement. What's the problem? What's the holdup? In chapter 4, there's opposition, and it's kind of all the way through the first half of Nehemiah. There are these two guys named Sanballat and Tobiah. And in chapter 4, Sanballat, he's angry and he's greatly incensed when he sees the progress going on the wall. So he begins to ridicule all the Jews involved in this. And he says, "What are those feeble Jews doing? Will they restore their wall? Will they offer sacrifices? Will they finish in a day? Can they bring the stones back to life from these heaps of rubble, burned as they are?" So he's ridiculing them, both as to who they are and what in the world do they think they're doing. Now that's not all. Tobiah, his sidekick, chimes in. Tobiah says, "What are they building? If even a fox climbed up on it, he'd break down their wall of stones." So again, look at the kind of ridicule that's going on. And they're trying to discourage any further action in the building of this wall around Jerusalem. And there are several times in Nehemiah, and I had sort of forgotten this, where in the recording of the story, without any introduction, Nehemiah bursts out in prayer. It's strange, and it sort of interrupts the flow of the story, but there are several places. Chapter 4 and verse 4. After Tobiah says, "What are they building? If even a fox climbed up on it, he would break down their wall of stones." Then all of a sudden, just in the middle of that, listen to this. "Hear us, O God, for we are despised. Turn their insults back on their own heads. Give them over as plunder in the land of captivity. Do not cover up their guilt or blot out their sins from your sight, for they have thrown insults in the face of the builders." So it's kind of like in the story, all of a sudden he bursts out in this prayer. "God, you take care of them. They're trying to ridicule us. They're trying to stop it. You take care of them." He doesn't say this much in the book, but reading through Nehemiah, I caught an insight here that I want to share with you. In this time of discouragement, a couple things could happen. When people have a dream, they're trying to go forward with it, and there's all kinds of discouragement that occurs. Some of it can be kind of natural. Others seems like it's deep spiritual warfare going on. But in the midst of that, it's important to recognize that you can pray to God for encouragement when everything around you looks like it's discouraging, and not to let the discouragers keep you from going forward, okay? I remember hearing one time an individual saying that he had all these wonderful ideas for ministry, and he went before this group of people and he presented it, and he said, the whole evening I felt like that all they did was take a fire hose on me. Hose me down because I was too excited with too many dreams. Well, that can occur, and you can get really discouraged. And what we need to do is be praying to God to give us the encouragement that may not feel like it's coming anymore because we are discouraged. So when the walls were built the first time around Jerusalem, it was a time of growth, an important time in Israel's history. But notice that the vision, the idealism, and the unity of Israel, when that original wall was built, some wonderful feelings about the nation of Israel, but that was replaced with blindness, compromise, discord, and discouragement. And you see it all through the rest of Nehemiah. And Nehemiah saw the problem because he cared. He realized what was going on. And if we had time, we could look at each one of these problems. In the book of Nehemiah, he steps forward and he proposes solutions as to how to deal with each one of these discouraging situations. And we'll look at a couple of them a little bit later. All encouragement begins with compassion. Do we really care? All encouragement begins with compassion. And as a result of that, he makes this statement that tenderheartedness is the womb of encouragement. The Bible talks about one of the characteristics of being Christ-like is being tenderhearted. I think too often we look at that maybe with a little bit of a negative connotation. We'll say, well, if they're tenderhearted, that means they wear their feelings on their sleeve and you can't say anything around them. And we have all these negative connotations when the New Testament sees tenderheartedness as the very core of our ability to empathize with other people. And he says tenderheartedness is the womb of encouragement. Okay, let's look at determination. You see, what Nehemiah wanted to make sure is that the people didn't just look at this as a public works project, because it certainly was. I mean, there's a lot of things needed to be rebuilt. But Nehemiah saw this as a new beginning with unlimited potential. And as I was going through the story, there's some things that are really important with this. First of all, he's really sad about the report that he gets. So one day he's in front of the king and the king sees him and he's sad. And the king makes a comment. Now the text says Nehemiah was very afraid. Well, because the king didn't want anyone around him to be depressed, so he'd end up being depressed. And I'm sure Nehemiah in the past had seen what the king did to some people who didn't have the right kind of demeanor coming into his court, okay? So he was aware of that. And as the king asked this question, he says, "Why does your face look so sad when you're not ill? This can be nothing but sadness of heart." And he says, "Well, why shouldn't I be sad when the city of my fathers lies in ruins?" And so the king says, "Well, what do you want?" And I love this because I think I've put it on here. No, it's a little bit later. Here it is. I call it an arrow prayer. "I prayed to the God of heaven, then I said to the king." That was a quick prayer. Think about it. And I don't know what he may have said. In his heart, he may have said, God, you got to help me. You know, think about this, because the way it's presented, then I prayed to the God of heaven, and I answered the king. Because the king's right there in front of him. So it must have been a real short prayer, and it was quick, and it was to the point. And I'm sure that in certain situations, we all have prayed those kind of prayers. And the confidence I get from this story and this narrative is, God hears those kind of prayers. God, you got to help me. Well, that's my recognition of my dependence upon God, no matter what the situation is. And then he says, if it pleases the king, and if your servant has found favor in his sight, let him send me to the city in Judah where my fathers are buried so that I can rebuild it. So as he is answering the king, he is with determination building this new vision. So he kind of knows what he wants. And notice that he was risking his position, really. But dreams are for the brave-hearted. When he's talking back and forth with the king, he wants the king to give him letters so that the governors and the territories where he passes through, he'll have the right of passage. And then he says, and because the gracious hand of my God was upon me, the king granted my request. Nehemiah understood that the gracious hand of God was upon him. During this time of stepping forward with a vision, being very determined, and asking for what he needed. It had to be bold. He had to be bold to ask for this. And it seems to me that part of each one of us with our Christian ministries that God has placed upon our heart, there come those times when we feel the gracious hand of God is upon us. And what's interesting, he says later on that he went down there to survey the situation, and he hadn't told anybody yet what God had put on his heart to do for Jerusalem. It's almost like there needs to be this time of the tea kettle simmering on the stove. You know, it's sitting there, it's sort of steaming, and it's getting steam, and he's thinking about all of this, and he's convinced God has put it on his heart. He hadn't told anybody yet, but he's working on this. And the opportunity to serve, Nehemiah tells us this with his life, is always a step up. Service in the Bible, committed to God's people, responding to a need, the servant is the one who's put in the highest position in the Bible. And it's interesting because that word, as you may know, in both the ancient world of the Old Testament and the world of the New Testament, the different forms that slavery and servants would take typically didn't have much of a positive connotation to it. And yet, those who are held up as servant leaders in the Old Testament, servant leaders in the New Testament, it is viewed as someone who has a heart for God and for his people, because you're willing to sacrifice yourself, step out of yourself, and allow God to use you for his kingdom purposes.
Very difficult situation that Nehemiah was in. We can't comprehend that because we can't imagine. But the whole city had been destroyed.
Yeah.
And some people had come back, and they had probably just brushed away the rubble around where they were going to live and just piled it up somewhere else and just worked on their little area. And when Nehemiah really did not, he hadn't seen it.
No.
And you just can't imagine coming back. If Oak Ridge were totally destroyed and in rubble,
yeah,
we can't imagine coming back and where would you start?
I know. Probably the closest illustration that I've seen on TV is either where a tornado goes through and levels a community, or like when Katrina leveled much of Baton Rouge and other areas. where do you start? I mean, there's so much devastation, and it doesn't look like it did before, and you go back to where you thought your home was. Where do you start? And that's sort of parallel to that, isn't it? It's told that, and see, that's why in the first part of chapter 1, you have his response that you do. He sits down and he mourns and he weeps and he prays and he fasts. I mean, it's devastating to him. But he doesn't allow that emotional devastation to keep him from getting up and taking action, which that's what we admire him for. I already said this in the planning. Look at chapter 2. Verse 11. I went to Jerusalem. After staying there 3 days, I set out during the night with a few men. I had not told anyone what God had put on my heart to do for Jerusalem. And there was no mounts with me except the one I was riding on. So he goes through, and then he tells them when he gets through with that surveying situation, you see the trouble we're in. Jerusalem lies in ruins, and its gates have been burned with fire. And he could have said, I don't see any way we can fix this. Let's just go back home where we came from. He doesn't say that. Now he assesses it. He says we're in big trouble. Jerusalem lies in ruins. Its gates have been burned with fire. Come, let us rebuild the wall of Jerusalem, and we will no longer be in disgrace. Now you have to understand something here. This disgrace that he's talking about, from Nehemiah's perspective, it's not just national disgrace. He recognizes that it's also the need to uphold the name of Jehovah God before the other nations. So it's not only a national disgrace, but he sees it even as a religious disgrace upon God's name among the nations. Then he said, I also told them, this is where he finally confesses, I also told them about the gracious hand of my God upon me and what the king had said to me. And then here was their response. Let us start rebuilding. So they began this good work. This was a good work. And without apparently much fanfare, well, let's start rebuilding. And I think it was because Nehemiah's resolve, and they saw that. Said, okay, let's get busy.
Well, you also have to realize here is an official visit from the king, Artaxerxes, and he comes with an entourage. He doesn't come by himself.
Right.
He's given footmen and soldiers. And this is
it's a big deal.
Pretty good showing that he comes along and then he kind of does all this all by himself and says, okay, here it is, here's the problem and here's the solution.
Yeah. You could just imagine, that's a neat mental picture. When he rides into town, he's got this big entourage and people are like, whoa, he means business. Now, Nehemiah, I wish that we had the blueprint, or I wish that we had, maybe if he sat down with a document, said, okay, this is how it's going to happen. There is no perfect plan. And I'm sure, and there are places through Nehemiah that it looks like things are beginning to unravel a little bit. And Nehemiah has to step up and say, okay, guys, here's how we're going to fix this. So it doesn't look like he had a perfect plan, but he certainly had a viable one. And if you're the kind of person, I used to be this way when I was younger, you think that you've got to have everything figured out and it's got to be perfect before you step forward and do something. Well, I hate to tell you, but if you've not discovered in your life yet, there is no such thing as the perfect plan. So what you have to do, with God's help, you put together one, and prayerfully it's a viable one, and you go forward. And then you're flexible enough to adjust where you need to.
There's more than one way to skin a cat. If you can't do it one way, figure out some other way to do it. I think the American people have been pretty good at doing that.
Yeah, there's a flexibility and a resiliency that, as I look at it, is sort of inherent within the Christian faith. And think about that. And it's because we see the Christian life as being one lived in and I love Nehemiah as an example. We live it in a stance where we're ready to respond to whatever the need is. And so if we had a fixed idea of how every day ought to look, and I'm only going to respond to certain things, after a while, I'm not quite sure God could use us very well. See, we need to be kind of poised, ready to go, and flexible for any moment, and resilient to use our gifts in that way. In the presentation section, he says, group encouragement requires a shared perception of a worthwhile and achievable goal. And the people who said, well, let's start building, we're ready, I think they latched onto that. And inspiration is derived from the ability to conceptualize practical and positive change. And this was important because as everybody's got their own section with their families, and I picked up on something. This was really cool. Since I have 2 daughters, in chapter 3, Shallum, he's the son of Halohesh, ruler of the half district of Jerusalem. He prepared the next section with the help of his daughters. I don't know what they did. Too bad we don't get the description of that. But it's like, and another thing that amazed me is, in the description of the wall being built, as kind of a secondary theme, the description we have is that it looks like most all parts of the society were involved. It wasn't just slaves or servants who were used to doing that. I went and circled some. Chapter 3:1, Eliashib the high priest and his fellow priests, they got busy and helped out. In verse 5, the men of Tekoa, a great group of guys. But notice their nobles would not put their shoulders to the work and under their supervisors. So there were some guys who just stood around and said, we're not going to do anything. Well, the men of Tekoa, they went ahead. Not only that, they come up again. And I'd forgotten this. This is in chapter 3 and verse 27. Next to them, the men of Tekoa repaired another section. So these guys, working really hard, got one entire section done, like, okay, bring on the next one. So what a great group of guys, and that's all we know about them. But go ahead.
Well, what the daughters did, they did everything everybody else was doing.
Yeah, I'm sure.
When I was growing up, we dug a basement under our house. And there was a man that came through town that they called him Digging Bill, and he and my daddy and my brother and all of us helped dig that basement.
Yeah.
And we did all the concrete blocks. I mixed mortar and I hit block. We did, and
So,
this was what they did. I mean, you pitch in and you work together.
You pitch in and you work together. I like that. There wasn't, and see, these guys in chapter 3 that were the nobles and the leaders, they were like, we're not doing this. And the guy's like, really? And so everybody pitches in, whether it's the gentleman with his daughters, you have goldsmiths, even the perfume makers. He goes out of his way to mention the perfume makers. And you would assume these might be guys who were sitting inside most of the day sniffing. Perfume makers, so they get involved. The rulers of the district, different districts, they get involved. There's another Nehemiah. I'd forgotten this, but in the list. There's a Nehemiah, son of Azbuk, ruler of the half district of Beth-zur. Let's see. Oh, there is Baruch, probably not the same Baruch related to Jeremiah, but there was a Baruch, son of Zavai. He's the only one where this expression is used. He zealously repaired another section. Now that's interesting. And I'm assuming maybe he wasn't the only one, but he zealously repaired it. Got through with one, let's go it again. Let's take another section. So you get the impression that for some of these folks, the enthusiasm just kind of began to build. And as they could see it going up, the enthusiasm kept on building. And they got excited about it. Nehemiah's careful planning, straight talk, and contagious enthusiasm won him the support that he needed. And you don't see anywhere in the narrative in the story where he tried to sort of soft soap everything or cover up what was really there. He said, no, we got to get to work. It is like this. And there are passages in the New Testament that talk about misguided zeal, or if you've got zeal for the wrong thing. Look at Galatians. This is an interesting verse. I know I've read it before, as we all have, but Galatians 4:17 and 18. Those people are zealous to win you over, but for no good. And when I read that, I thought, okay, that sounds like Tobiah and Sanballat in Nehemiah. What they want is to alienate you from us so that you may be zealous for them. It's fine to be zealous, provided the purpose is good, and to be so always and not just when I'm with you. But it's fine to be zealous, but make sure you're doing it for the right purpose. And in Nehemiah, we see this happening. Problem solving. The criticism that they had to face. In chapter 4 of Nehemiah, there's a lot of criticism. Nehemiah says in verse 6, we rebuilt the wall till all of it reached half its height, so they got halfway up, for the people worked with all their heart. So they were committed, they were working hard, and they saw it happen. But then Sanballat, Tobiah, the Arabs, the Ammonites, the men of Ashdod, when they saw all of that and the gates were closing, they were very angry, so they all plotted together. They wanted to stir up trouble against us. But notice, and this is a neat phrase, but we prayed to our God and we posted a guard night and day to meet this threat. We prayed to God and we posted a guard. I love that. Because what that means is you realize there's some responsibility on your part, but you can't do it alone. And you realize that you can't just stand there and say, okay, God, you do it all. But he said, we prayed to God and we posted a guard. I love that. Yeah, they put feet on their prayer. And that's a neat model for the Christian life. There's a lot of things we know that we can't do by ourselves. And yet there are a lot of things that we need to be accountable for, but we need to pray to God. And God participates in that. And we believe that God watches and God cares. The hardship, there's a section in Nehemiah where Nehemiah recognizes that there were people ruling before him and some of the people working around him that really put a hardship on the people. Way too many taxes. They would come in, the rulers would come in and take all of the food, not give them any. It's really a sad story. But in spite of the hardship, Nehemiah walked in one day and said, look, this has got to stop. He said, we're going to treat people right. Nobody's going to be taken advantage of. And I'm not even going to eat my lot of what you think I should. Because I'm just right here with you guys. We're going to do this right. And even though discouragement was there, he said, we need to look beyond the rubble. And that's what encouragement is. Sometimes when individuals come to you and they've got all kinds of things going in their life, if you could have this mental image, this would really help. They're talking to you with their head just above the rubble in their life. Think about that. They're just peeking just above the rubble, and they're like, help. And if you could realize that when people are in that situation, they have got to have a word of encouragement. And that's the perfect time for you to look beyond that rubble and help them see a new vision. In chapter 6 of Nehemiah, there's all kinds of distractions. I think it's Sanballat and Tobiah cook up another plan, and they're like, well, I tell you what, why don't you stop your work for a while, come down in here in the villages and the plains of Ono, and let's talk about this thing. And apparently, 4 times, he kept sending this letter out to the emissaries, to Nehemiah, saying, why don't y'all just stop a minute, let's talk. And Nehemiah goes, no, we're involved in something way too important than to stop and talk to you, because I know what you're up to. And he talks about problem solving with fear. Courageous leaders must act on their faith. They must stand on principle at all times, but especially during crisis. When times are hard, good biblical leaders, whatever role, servant leaders, whatever role they're taking, they stand on principle, and especially when times are hard. Now, when the capstone, apparently, was set in place, there was time for celebration. And I'd forgotten the scene of celebration. I knew that they were glad it was over with. But if you look over in chapter 12, at the dedication of the wall, Nehemiah does this. He pulls together all these different people to celebrate, and he has two choirs. One of the choirs, he has them go up on the wall, and we don't know how many singers there were in the choir. But then he has another group of choirs up on the other wall, and they're facing each other. And they give this thanks and apparent praise. And once they get through with that, then they all kind of march into the temple together. It's a great scene of celebration. And what our author says is that when you do a work together, celebration and praise is vital when that work is done. And actually, for those of us who are in small groups, we need to be aware of this. Anytime your small group accomplishes something, it is an excuse for celebration. And that's important. And it can be, you can celebrate any way you want to, but just think of how much it encourages people when they hear, well done. That was fantastic. Thank you. People need that. And when people don't get that, then they become discouraged to the point that they're not willing to do anymore. Praise was given to God for completion of the project. Reflection upon this entire episode makes us aware, and listen to this phrase, this was wonderful, that encouraging leaders are the wind beneath the wings of shared dreams. Wow. Wind beneath our wings. What a great... And tonight, if we had time, if we could do a neat exercise of where I'd have you prayerfully reflect, who have been the individuals in my life that had given me wind beneath my wings at those critical moments when I really needed encouragement? What a great thing to think of. Who are those people? 10 steps for encouraging groups, and we'll be done. We'll just highlight these. Lean on God, of course, very important. Identify the needs, which Nehemiah did. He really took time to scope things out. Assess the situation. Make a detailed plan. And for those of you who are not detail-oriented, as I was thinking about this when I put that, I said, well, what you need to do is grab somebody, that knows what you're up to, and they've got that gift of deep, detailed planning that you don't have. Grab them under your wing and let them be part of the dream. Articulate a compelling vision. This is what we're going to do. Delegate and organize. Very important. And expect criticism. Not that it might happen, it will happen. And I've often said this to people. The more criticism you receive sometimes is in direct correlation to how much good you're doing. Think about that. Resist distraction, because it's going to come in all forms. Follow through to the end, and then celebrate. What a great lesson this was. To think about the courage that it takes whenever we need to encourage others. Take your hymn book. You got one in front of you. And I want to end class tonight by singing number 462. Oh, for a faith that will not shrink. And it's got a simple tune, so it shouldn't be too hard for us. Number 462. Oh.
For a faith that will not shrink,